In the fields of Belgium and northern France, an entire generation was trapped in a brutal, grinding war of mud, blood, and barbed wire. The Western Front was where World War I became a nightmare, a place where strategies failed, millions died, and the world changed forever. In this episode of History in Under 15 Minutes, we'll break down the horrors, the heroes, and the legacy of the Western Front, trench by trench, year by year. The spark that lit the world. World War I began with a gunshot in Sarajevo in 1914, but its roots ran deep. Tangled alliances, imperial ambitions, and rising nationalism created a powder keg in Europe. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated, the continent unraveled into chaos. Germany invaded Belgium, triggering Britain's entry into the war. France mobilized. Within weeks, millions of soldiers were on the move. The Western Front, a 400-mile line stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border, would become the heart of the conflict. The Schlieffen Plan and the Race to the Sea, Germany's war plan, the Schlieffen Plan, aimed to quickly knock France out of the war by sweeping through Belgium and encircling Paris. But stiff Belgian resistance, delays, and the arrival of British forces at Mons and Marne stalled the advance. The French, rallying with the famous taxis of the Marne, stopped the German army just miles from Paris. What followed was the race to the sea. Both sides dug trenches as they tried to outflank each other. By late 1914, the war of movement had ended. A new kind of war, static, brutal, and attritional, had begun. Trench warfare. Life underground. The Western Front soon became defined by its trenches, zigzagging lines of mud and misery, protected by barbed wire, machine guns, and artillery. Soldiers lived in waterlogged ditches, surrounded by rats, lice, and disease. Going over the top, charging into no man's land, meant facing near certain death. New weapons like poison gas, flamethrowers, and tanks were introduced, but none could deliver a breakthrough. The front barely moved. Battles lasted months and achieved little. Men endured mud, fear, and trauma day after day, for inches of ground. Verdun, hell on earth. In 1916, the Germans launched a massive assault on Verdun, hoping to bleed France white. The battle lasted nearly a year, becoming a symbol of French resistance and sacrifice. Over 700,000 casualties were recorded for a few miles of land. Verdun was a fortress and a graveyard. French General Pétain promised, "Ils ne passeront pas." They shall not pass. And they didn't. But the cost was horrific. Verdun marked the true horror of industrial war. Mass death with minimal gain. The Somme, a British tragedy. To relieve pressure on Verdun, the British launched an offensive at the Somme. On July 1, 1916, thousands of British soldiers went over the top and were met with devastating machine gun fire. It was the bloodiest day in British military history. 60,000 casualties in a single day. The battle dragged on for months, introducing tanks for the first time, but failing to break the German lines. The Somme exposed the failure of outdated tactics against modern firepower. Generals expected breakthroughs. Instead, they got stalemates and slaughter. Technology and stalemate. The Western Front was a laboratory of death. Machine guns mowed down entire units in seconds. Artillery, far more deadly than bullets, shattered bodies and landscapes. Gas, chlorine, phosgene, and mustard turned the air into poison. Airplanes, once scouts, became bombers and dogfighters. Tanks, still primitive, often broke down but offered a glimpse of future warfare. But technology alone couldn't end the deadlock. For every new weapon, there was a counter. For every push, a counterattack. The trenches absorbed everything. The human cost, a lost generation. The toll was staggering. Millions were killed, millions more wounded, maimed, or psychologically scarred. Trench foot, shell shock, and endless mud became part of daily life. Letters from soldiers spoke of fear, boredom, and disbelief at the horror around them. Civilians, too, suffered. Cities were bombed, farmland destroyed, and resources drained. Entire towns lost their young men. A whole generation vanished into the trenches of the Western Front. American entry and the final push. In 1917, the U.S. entered the war, tipping the balance. American troops brought fresh manpower, morale, and resources. Meanwhile, Germany launched a last desperate offensive in spring 1918, advancing rapidly but exhausting its forces. The Allied counteroffensive, bolstered by American troops and new coordination, pushed the Germans back. The Hundred Days Offensive saw the front finally move, and Germany collapse. On November 11, 1918, the guns fell silent. The armistice was signed. The war was over, but its impact had just begun. The aftermath. A shattered world. The Western Front left behind more than trenches and tombstones. It left behind a continent physically and emotionally shattered. Entire regions of France and Belgium were reduced to cratered wastelands, dotted with ruined villages and scorched fields. Infrastructure was obliterated, railways twisted by shellfire, and rivers poisoned by chemicals. Economies across Europe were devastated. France lost much of its industrial northeast, while Britain was buried under debt. Germany, though not invaded, was left politically humiliated and socially fractured. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, sought to prevent future conflict, but instead bred resentment. It placed full blame for the war on Germany, demanded enormous reparations, and stripped it of territory and military strength. Many Germans saw it not as peace, but as punishment, a grievance that would fester. The psychological toll was just as severe. Millions of men returned home wounded, blinded, or shell-shocked. Civilians who had lost brothers, fathers, and sons found little solace in the so-called victory. The Western Front had promised glory, but delivered only grief. It became the ultimate symbol of futility in modern warfare, where the industrial age had turned killing into a science, and diplomacy had failed to save humanity from itself. Legacy, lessons. Written in blood, expanded. The Western Front forever changed the nature of warfare and the world's understanding of conflict. It revealed the brutal mechanization of death, how artillery, machine guns, gas, and barbed wire could grind entire armies into dust without moving the front lines. It exposed the failures of leadership, where outdated strategies met modern weapons, resulting in catastrophe. And yet, amid the horror, it showcased the resilience of the human spirit, soldiers who endured unthinkable conditions, medics who risked everything, and families who held on through unbearable loss. Culturally, the Western Front left an indelible mark. The arts, literature, and film of the 20th century returned to the trenches as a central theme of trauma and disillusionment. Works like All Quiet on the Western Front, Paths of Glory, and the poetry of Wilfred Owen gave voice to the silence of the dead and the brokenness of the survivors. The cemeteries and memorials of northern France stand as haunting reminders of a war whose goals were forgotten long before the last shot was fired. Politically, the war reshaped borders and ideologies. It contributed to the fall of empires, the rise of nationalism, and the conditions that would lead to World War II. The Western Front became more than a battlefield. It became a warning carved in blood. Never again. Yet, just a generation later, the world would forget. The trenches were filled in, but the lessons were not always learned. Cliffhanger: From War to War Again. The Great War, later known as World War I, was once called the War to End All Wars. But the peace that followed was anything but lasting. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, punished Germany harshly, stripping it of land, limiting its military, and forcing it to accept full blame for the war. These terms caused deep humiliation, economic collapse, and political unrest within Germany. The treaty didn't bring healing. It planted the seeds of resentment. At the same time, the collapse of long-standing empires, the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian, and German, left behind a chaotic map of new nations, drawn with little regard for ethnic or historical realities. This fragile new world was unstable and tense. Amid this confusion, fascism began to rise. In Italy, Benito Mussolini took power in 1922, promising strength and national pride. In Germany, Adolf Hitler followed a similar path, using propaganda, economic despair, and nationalism to gain support. The global economy worsened during the Great Depression, pushing more people to trust authoritarian leaders who promised to restore greatness and order. Democracy faltered, and extremism thrived. Instead of building lasting peace, the post-war world built a fragile structure, one that would crumble just 20 years later. In Part 2, we'll follow how this path, from the muddy trenches of World War I to the flawed peace that followed, led the world once again into the fires of war.